I won't be talking about Hambledon, so if anybody wants to talk to me afterwards, they can. I'm the Flood and Water Manager at Hampshire County Council. I'm just going to talk to you about some of our examples and what we've been doing. Don't pretend to have any options or solutions or outcomes, so there's going to be a lot of questions in this and issues. This map actually shows the whole of Hampshire County Council with a little bit trimmed off the end. I'm sorry if anyone's from over there. These are the flood incidents reported to Hampshire County Council and the Environment Agency in 2013, 2014. As you can see, they're everywhere. There's quite a few of them. Across the whole of the county, we had 335 houses were actually flooded, so that's people's homes. We had significant areas of our strategic infrastructure flooded for long periods of time. And as you can see, it's across almost the whole area of Hampshire. The green dots are Environment Agency, the red dots are ours. This doesn't show the source of flooding because often when we get an incident in, we don't actually know what caused the flooding. I just wanted to go through a couple of examples. This is an area called Buckskin in Basingstoke. Buckskin is just to the west of the town centre of Basingstoke. The large area at the bottom is where the houses are, and there's another ponded area just to the north of that. 45 properties were flooded in Buckskin. We had lots of local roads shut there, which meant access to the wider estate was also cut off. In the blue blob at the top was actually a substation which was at significant risks of inundation during the event. And there was a combination of sources, but predominantly groundwater. We did complete a Section 19 investigation, and that's actually on our website. The graph at the bottom is actually the local borehole that's monitored by the Environment Agency. The blue dotted line is the rise in that groundwater in the preceding period to the flooding, which occurred at the beginning of February. And over about a week in January, the groundwater in that borehole rose about 2 metres. So then petered out a bit and then rose again. So Buckskin is at a level of around 95 metres above sea level. So we kind of had flooding emergence in that location above that level. Another example of areas that are flooded within Hampshire is something called the Bourne Rivulet. That's the large drawing picture on the left. The dots are kind of zoomed in instances. The Bourne Rivulet is a main river. It's predominantly dry, but it is groundwater fed. And historically, the road and all the houses are at the bottom of the valley there, which meant that this whole catchment was basically cut off at various locations during the 2013-2014 event. This area does have a history of flooding, but nothing really to this extent. The little picture is a little area called Littleton, which is just north of Winchester. This had a number of issues with springs appearing in locations which historically people hadn't ever expected them to. So they'd been popping up in different locations. The water then kind of flows over land and then rejoins the main river coming through. Now, there is a main river through Littleton, but you cannot find it. So it's one of those situations where it seems to be just a depression. So the issues for Hampshire in particular was this flooding in multiple villages, in multiple catchments, large areas cut off, 1 or 2 properties flooded in each of these villages, and flooding geographically over quite a large area. Although there was the odd 1 or 2 properties, the spread was quite large. Mainly the groundwater rose quite high, then overland flow occurred, but also all the existing infrastructure became overwhelmed during those events. Hampshire's approach at the moment, and it is still developing, is we have a local flood risk management strategy that was done in 2 years ago, I think. On the back of that, we wanted to do surface water management plans and groundwater management plans. Those are kind of being reviewed because what we found from experience is actually the flooding, it's difficult to say it's just surface water or it's just groundwater in lots of these instances, because some people are experiencing what they would call surface water, which is overland flow, but actually it's coming from a groundwater source. So we've not scrapped those so much, we're reviewing those and we're trying to work more to a catchment approach, which would involve grouping the communities that were affected into one catchment to see whether there's any kind of options we can use to reduce flooding in that catchment specifically. So, for example, the Bourne Rivulet would be a catchment. We've got a couple of catchment pilot schemes with our partners. So our partners are the usual suspects, I would say. So that's the likes of the Environment Agency, our district colleagues, because obviously we're county, and also to try and develop some form of way of working out whether there's a better cost-benefit model that we can use for catchments rather than, for example, Bourne Rivulet villages, or a lot of villages in Hampshire will not get funding because there's a couple of properties flooding, but if you look at the whole catchment that was effectively cut off, that's quite a big significant impact for that area. So we're kind of trying to focus on that approach more, and it moves us away from the source-based review. So we're not looking at surface water and we're not looking at groundwater. We're saying this area flooded, what happened, and then we can move on from there. But we haven't just decided to write another plan or do another strategy, because that doesn't really help anyone on the ground. What we've been looking at is quite a lot of local work. We've done a number of investigations, not Section 19 investigations, small investigations, what we call river walks, where we meet with local residents and actually walk the length of the catchment that was affected and identify small local measures that can be done, either maintenance on infrastructure or identify restrictions in the flow from the existing things that are on the ground. And that's actually helped us with engagement with local residents quite a bit. It is resource hungry, as you can imagine, and we don't have a massive team, but we find if we can group communities together, it means we can reduce the kind of resource issues on those. So I'm afraid I'm going to go back to Buckskin. We did a Section 19. A consultant did it for us, but we didn't ask them to do any recommendations. We asked them to raise issues. The recommendations really have come from ourselves and the other authorities who are involved in it. And a number of things were picked up through that report. One of them is the use of the boreholes to try and provide better monitoring. The monitoring borehole that is used covers a very large area. So when our colleagues at District get the groundwater alert, it covers the largest area. They cannot pinpoint where it's actually going to occur. Now, in Basingstoke, there are lots of these drier valleys across the town. None of the others actually experienced any flooding, so it was just very specific to this location. There is a closer borehole, and we're now looking at whether we can use that to provide a slightly better level. Unfortunately, it's on private land and it's not monitored. It's not automatically monitored, whereas the other one is. So we need to develop that understanding a bit better. We're also looking at issues with existing infrastructure. Buckskin drains to soakaways, both the highway drainage and the private drainage. The picture at the top there, which is lovely, is a ditch full of rubbish. So there's quite large ditches throughout Basingstoke town. There's highway drainage and there's also private drainage. So there's been some extensive work following the flooding to just have a look at those, try and locate them. A lot of the things we didn't know where they were, and to obviously provide some cleaning and any remedial works. Now, that has identified that actually, although the system, yes, needed a bit of remedial work, it needed a bit of desilting, it didn't have any defects which would have stopped it from working. And also, our colleagues at Thames Water have CCTV'd quite a large area of the foul drainage system. And again, they didn't have much ingress from pipes or manholes under the ground. The water came above the ground and then sat above the manholes, which then leaked into the foul drainage system within Buckskin. This is the area around the substation. Strategically, the substation is in the lowest point of this bowl, which actually serves about 3,000 properties in Basingstoke, and it was at chest height, the water at this point. The picture at the bottom, I don't think you can see, the big red thing next to the boat is the biggest pump I have ever seen, I think. And that was pumping out from inside the substation out to outside. But the armed services came and sandbagged that. I know we've been talking about sandbags. They did actually work here with a bit of over-pumping. That substation is now being looked to be moved, because obviously it's not in a particularly resilient location, to area of higher ground. So specifically for groundwater, the issue has been raised in whether we can pump out the groundwater to lower it all in Hampshire. We can't, because it's huge. But there was some talk about maybe we could do it locally. There are some very local boreholes to Buckskin, where you could potentially over-abstract. The issue that we have is that there's obviously all kinds of licensing for our colleagues at South East Water. They control the boreholes, and it's not clear where this water would go once we've got it out of the ground. So it is something, we do have quite a lot of reports on the hydrogeology of that location, and also working with our colleagues from the Environment Agency, really to put that one to bed, I think, is probably my answer on that. But, you know, it's a lot of the work is driven by councillors and residents, and so if they raise an issue, we do have to acknowledge it and work with them. The other issue for Buckskin is whether or not we can do something with the water once it gets above ground. So it floods, it starts to come above ground. What can we do with it? The water in the area around by the houses actually had an average depth of about 200 mil. But there was some local flow from the kind of southern end up towards the northern end, basically because it was a very long bathtub. And tankering was occurring, quite significant amount of tankering, which didn't really make a huge amount of difference during the emergency response. The other area to the north was actually pumped out into the headwaters of the River Loddon during the emergency response. That required over 1 kilometre of above ground pipe work and also 7,000 litres per second of pumping. There was some reports that it helped, but it was difficult to tell whether it helped because the groundwater level was going down at the same time. So there is this potentially to do something with the water once it becomes above ground, maybe temporarily store it. The problem we have in Basingstoke is it is heavily developed. There are no large open areas which potentially would be able to take that amount of water once you get it above ground. There may be an option is once the substation is moved to use that area, because there aren't any houses or infrastructure affected by that at that location. So the summary of the approach that we're doing at the moment is we're looking at priority areas. After a considerable amount of firefighting, we had a number of instances we had to look at. We're also collating as much information as we can on what happened where, and going out and about and getting information from residents. We're moving away from source-led plans to catchment, and really that there doesn't appear to be one size fits all. In one location, for example, in the Bourne Rivulet example, you may be able to move the water to somewhere else and just keep it there for a while because it's in a rural location, there's lots of open fields. Basingstoke probably not going to be able to do that because there aren't those areas. We don't think abstraction across the whole of the groundwater in Hampshire is going to help us or be a practical solution. Might be some local solutions. And so we are looking at this, can we manage groundwater once it gets above the surface? The example of Littleton is interesting because those springs came up and then flowed across the land, but they didn't come up in that location the previous event. So if we do anything permanent or semi-permanent, we've got to be careful that we're not then just putting it in the wrong location and then it ends up going through someone's property because it changed during the next 10 years. And we're very focused on spending time going out and looking at local areas and also talking to residents. It is resource intensive, but it is very useful because you can pick up the very local instances and things that worked locally and try and then put that back into the plan. I want to leave you on one slide, which is challenges. And they're probably the same as they always have been, so I won't go through them in detail. But managing expectations was an issue for us, mainly because the emergency event, happened over 2 months. It didn't happen over a day and then everybody moved on. The emergency event, for example, in Buckskin was for 2 months. So we were starting to investigate whilst the event was still happening. So that kind of muddied the waters. God, it's really bad pun, isn't it? Sorry. Muddied the waters a little bit. We also have this issue with prioritisation. I think it goes back to, we know what flooded in 2013, 2014. We know what flooded in 2000 and 2001. Do we prioritise those areas over what we might think might happen in the future? And bearing in mind, there are a number of these little, at the top of the Loddon, for example, and Basingstoke, there's a number of these little prongs that come out. Are we supposed to be looking at those areas that didn't flood this year but could do in future years? Engagement and empowering residents is always very, very difficult, but we've found them incredibly useful of understanding the small things that happen during an event that actually can make quite a big difference. And working effectively with other organisations. We have a number of multi-agency groups from a number of locations, and I think it's trying to work together a bit more effectively. Yes, we have our own roles and responsibilities, but at the end of the day, people on the ground, residents, communities don't really care. They just want to know that something is being done.